I just heard one of the greatest lines of all time, and we need to live by it. I could have used this like 10 years ago. People only get upset about your boundaries when they intend on crossing them. Let me say that again. Other people only get upset about boundaries you put in place for yourself when you have put a boundary, a blockage in place so that they cannot cross your boundary. Respect. Keep that in mind. Live by that.
It's for the husbands or the partners of people with toxic in-laws, as in it's your parents. If you don't want to process your trauma, if you don't want to set boundaries, that's your prerogative. I got opinions on that, but not the point of my video. The first thing you can do to help your marriage, to help your partner get to some better place with this, is validate their feelings, acknowledge that they aren't the problem, and give them a green light to take some space. A sentence like, "I'm really sorry that my mom is like this. You don't have to see her anymore if you don't want to." The reason you don't do that is because then you have to field questions about where your wife is, how come she's not coming, and then you have to listen, likely, to negative talk about your wife because she's not there. None of that is your wife's problem. That's your boundary to set. Mom, I'm not going to let you talk about my wife that way. For better or for worse does not include mental and emotional abuse. Your wife agreed to love you for better or for worse. She did not agree to fielding passive-aggressive remarks about her parenting style or being called nasty names simply because she also has parents that see your kids.
Sister-in-law in a Desi household. Now, I don't even have to get into this for all of us to know exactly what I'm talking about. The one that's the center of the drama, the one that gives you a bad name in front of your husband and your in-laws, stirs the pot to start conflict. The list honestly goes on. How do you set boundaries with toxic sister-in-laws so that they're not sabotaging your marriage? Just like I said for your mother-in-law, ask your husband to set those boundaries with your sister-in-law, not you. For almost the same reason, she'll be much more forgiving towards her brother than she ever will be towards you. Secondly, avoid getting sucked into the drama. And trust me when I say they will try to suck you into the drama. Know your place and stay in it. She's getting into an argument with your husband? Repeat after me. You do not get involved. They're siblings. You are not. She's getting into it with your mother-in-law? Again, do not get involved. She asks you for your opinion, trying to befriend you, asking, what do you think about this? This is how I was treated by her family members. You acknowledge her feelings, but you do not badmouth or say anything remotely against his family or taking her side. This next one is going to be really difficult, especially if she's the type to attack you. But many times these types of people are looking for a reaction out of you. Try your best to stay neutral, walk away. Simply say, I don't appreciate the tone in which you're speaking to me right now. When you're ready to have a calm conversation, we can come back to this. The last thing you want to do is react and get angry. The way you conduct yourself matters, and anything you say and do will be used against you. If you do have to go over any type of argument with her, or she wants to break down something that happened, stick to the facts. Do not use accusatory language. I talked about this before. Use I statements and avoid using you. Limit your interactions to what is absolutely necessary. Be polite, be civil, but otherwise keep her at an arm's length distance. You don't let your guard down and start getting emotionally invested. Just trust me. No matter how much you think that you are close now, and under no circumstance do you ever, and I mean ever, confide in her to talk about your mother-in-law to her. That's just like a no-go zone. You do not get emotionally invested like that. Communicate clearly with your husband. Don't criticize his sister in front of him. Simply talk about your feelings and how it makes you feel when certain things are done. For example, honey, when your sister said that I was a psychopath to your mom, it really made me feel super disrespected. There's so much more to unpack here about the toxic sister-in-laws and setting boundaries with them, so follow along for part 2. We're unpacking it.
You know what one of the worst feelings as an adult is? It's being married and having your husband's family think that any issues or problems are coming from you and that your husband doesn't have a mind of his own. I didn't force him to say that. I didn't encourage him to say that. I didn't tell him to do anything. In fact, I'm over here trying to be devil's advocate for you. But then you find out oh, they just think you're manipulating him and tricking him. We love that. He said that and did that because you pissed him off, not because I forced him to do anything. Maybe don't piss him off next time. Maybe treat his partner with respect and his family with respect. I don't know what to tell you.
I'm a narcissistic mother-in-law. Of course the birth of your child is about me. You wouldn't have the child if it wasn't for me. It's my son and my grandbaby. I'm a narcissistic mother-in-law. Of course I only indirectly communicate with you through my son. But if you want to communicate with me, you need to contact me directly. Where's your respect? I'm a narcissistic mother-in-law. Why would you expect help from me postpartum? What do I look like? The maid? I'm a narcissistic mother-in-law. Of course I have a problem with you breastfeeding. It's selfish, and you're intentionally keeping me from bonding with my grandchild. I'm a narcissistic mother-in-law. Of course you have to appease me. My son can't marry anyone who doesn't bow down to his mother. I'm a narcissistic mother-in-law. Of course I'm going to make all of your big moments about me. I'm a narcissistic mother-in-law. I have multiple personas. Of course I treat you differently in different settings. I do have an image to uphold. I'm a narcissistic mother-in-law. Of course the other women in my family don't like you. I've already villainized you, so they'll have no interest in getting to know you. Besides, I need people on my side. You've already taken my son. I'm a narcissistic mother-in-law. Yes, our relationship got worse after you married and had a child with my son. You were supposed to be temporary. I'm the only permanent woman in his life. I'm a narcissistic mother-in-law. I'll only engage with the grandchild I have the most control with. I'm a narcissistic mother-in-law. I'm treating you like the other woman because you are.
Do you want to know the number one question I get in my DMs? How do you handle your mother-in-law's passive-aggressive comments? It's knowing that when someone speaks to me that way, it comes from a place of deep insecurity and lack of confidence. You know what conversation they want to have, but they just don't have the confidence to bring it up. For me, I would bring it up. For example, if my mother-in-law stayed at home, raised her babies, and she didn't work outside the house, and then here's me choosing to work outside the house and send my kids to daycare, and I can tell she's got some concerns about that. Let's say she makes some comments. Ooh, another woman raising my kids. I feel so bad for little Jamesy having to get up so early, and I would know, okay, so she's got some concerns about this. So I would go to her with empathy and just care, because I know she's not confident enough to just bring it up. And I would say, hey, Julie, it seems like you have some concerns about me working and the kids going to childcare. I was wondering, would you like to have a conversation about this?
This is for the mothers-in-law. There is such a huge difference between your daughter-in-law having boundaries and your daughter-in-law being controlling. It might not feel like it's a big difference, but I promise you it is. Her having boundaries is not her controlling you. The ball's in your court. She's simply telling you what she's going to tolerate and what she's going to be comfortable around. And depending on how young her children are, what her children are going to be around. Before anyone gets real ornery in the comments, what about the husband? Doesn't my son have a say? I think a lot of your sons are more on board with what their wife is saying than you guys might think. And she didn't brainwash him. They're just free-thinking adults who are in a loving, committed relationship. And if you're butthurt about that, then I don't even know why you had kids, quite honestly.
This comment said, I would like to get your take on in-laws. In-laws are a huge cause of problems in a lot of marriages, but I think this is very simple and it should be straightforward. I think people make it way more complicated than it should be because they're immature. Your spouse should always come before any in-laws. Like, my husband comes before my family of origin and I come before his family of origin because we're building a life together. And like, I notice like sometimes men won't stick up for their wives against their own family and they'll let things slide. Like, first of all, I would never let disrespect towards my spouse from my family slide, and my husband would never let it slide on his end. And mind you, I have the best in-laws. Like, my mother-in-law especially is like my favorite person. She's so amazing. So I know that I got really fortunate in that area. Just tell you, like, you should never let an in-law, your own family member, disrespect your spouse. Like, that's where a huge resentment can, if they're crossing boundaries, get them out of there. It's weird. It's really weird when people let their parents interrupt their marriage. Like, why would you have more loyalty to your parents than the person that's your lover, that you have kids with, that you're building a life with? Like, I've just always thought that was really weird.
Nothing pisses off a toxic mother-in-law more than when you know how to set boundaries and hold the line. I am hanging out at the cottage, at the lake, by myself, because I wanted my husband and my bonus daughter and grandbaby to go and see my husband's mom before we head home to Washington State. But I also know that my inner peace is way more important than having to put on some fake face and attempt to be around someone who will never like me. No matter what I do, no matter how I act, I will never live up to her standards. And I'm okay with that, because at the end of the day, I don't have FOMO. And I won, I guess, because I get to go home with her son, even though she's done what she's been able to try and do to cause divides between us, and it's never worked, not even with my bonus daughter. But it will be interesting to see how the conversation went when they went down to spend time with her. They're literally less than a mile away. And I'm thriving lakeside in sunshine, knowing that I'm not having to stress and worry about not saying the wrong thing or not being too quiet.
This is why I talk about decentering in-laws. So what do you do when you have to see your in-laws after a certain amount of time because of a family event, and you're nervous about it because you know how they're going to act, because you know how they are? First thing to remember is that your boundaries are for you, not other people. And that when we as women tap back into our intuition and our inner wisdom, which is oftentimes taken away from us at a very young age, we're told to accommodate and be nice and cater to other people, especially to men, and then subsequently to their families when we get married. So we tend to focus on our in-laws' shitty behavior, if they are shitty. Because we have been sold this bill of goods that when we get married, it's going to be happily ever after. And once we realize, oh, well, every family has its dysfunction, right? But maybe this is a little extra and we need to set some firmer boundaries here. That tends to take over our emotions and our mental capacity oftentimes, right? The mental load that we take on as women is put into setting these boundaries with our in-laws. And what is my mother-in-law or sister-in-law or brother-in-law or father-in-law or whoever going to say? And how am I going to feel? Am I going to be triggered when I am around them? Even if you have boundaries. But your boundary is for you. So if, or maybe it's more likely when, someone in your on your in-laws side of the family, in-law side of the family, says something inappropriate, that's on them. That's for them to own. That's for them to deal with. Let them, right? That's them. Your boundary is for you to say to yourself, that's how they are. I'm not going to allow this to ruin my night or take up any more mental or emotional space in my life. That's the boundary. And the more you practice that mentality and that mindset, and also practice self-compassion and being kind to yourself after you are at an event with them or even during that event, the easier the interactions or the times that you do have to be around them because of family events will become. And a big part of decentering your in-laws is not allowing them to ruin special events like a recital for you, for your children, for a loved one, not ruining or tainting those family events with their bullshit. This is why decentering is so important. You're taking the focus off of their behavior, off of the probability that they are going to say or do something inappropriate at some point during the evening, and you just say to yourself, that's on them. It's not excusing their behavior. It's not that's just how they are kind of thing. It's saying to yourself, I'm not going to allow this to ruin my night or anyone else's night. I'm just going to let it go and focus on the recital. Maybe it's for your kiddo, and have a great evening and not focus on that. I'm going to focus on.
We hear a lot about the children of narcissistic or toxic parents and how that dynamic is, but what about the partners of those adult children? Like, what about the son-in-law or daughter-in-law that's subjected to the narcissistic abuse or dealing with emotionally immature in-laws, the enmeshment, or just the overall unhealthy, dysfunctional dynamic of their partner's family of origin? It can be really traumatizing because you experience a lot of gaslighting and manipulation, and some of this may come from your own partner because they're expecting you to just deal with the treatment they've dealt with their entire life in the name of keeping the peace. You may have been casted as the villain from the time they met you because you are viewed as an outsider of their system, which for your mother-in-law or father-in-law or other members of that family makes you a threat to their system. New adult partners who clearly aren't going anywhere means change will be happening, and most dysfunctional families or people who thrive off control do not like change. It can cause you to second guess yourself and feel you aren't good enough. It can have a negative impact on your mental health because you now have to mentally prepare to be around said people, and whenever you are, your body is in fight or flight mode, you experience anxiety, or you just can't wait until you're no longer in the same space.
A grief process can also be attached to this dynamic because not only do you not have an ideal, healthy relationship with your in-laws, but your children probably won't have one either. And this is especially true if you and your partner decide to go low or no contact. You may feel robbed of the fantasy you had of your in-laws loving you and you loving them and all the great experiences you could have had. You may feel sadness for your child knowing they have grandparents they won't really know due to the toxicity of said grandparents. You may feel proud of your spouse because for the first time in their life, they're not going for bullshit. They're not going for the mistreatment of their partner or their child. But you also feel sadness for your partner because their parent or family of origin isn't who they need them to be. You may feel frustration, happiness, rage, guilt, sadness, and confusion. You know your feelings are valid, but sometimes you feel they aren't. You live in a society that normalizes this unhealthy experience. You see it depicted on TV, the mother-in-law who hates the daughter-in-law because she's taking the oldest son or only son away from her. It's a mindfuck. It's traumatizing. And the depths of this experience is not talked about enough.
Your in-laws driving you crazy? Here are a few tips. First one is you don't confront the in-laws. The rule of thumb is that each partner addresses their own parents, their own family. If you confront your in-laws, you're just going to be the bad guy, right? And you're going to create drama. You don't want to do that. Second is set clear boundaries. You and your partner need to decide for each other, and if you have kids, as a family, what the boundaries are. So for example, if you don't like people just dropping by your house or your apartment, then you need to each be responsible for talking to your own family saying, hey, we both don't want this, so please respect this boundary. If you guys come to the table focusing on the relationship, putting your union first, that will be your guide and you will be all set.
Talking to the daughters-in-law today. What's your line? What's too much? When do you call it? Should you ever call it? I'm here to remind you that if your line on how much mistreatment you're willing to endure is different than somebody else's, it's still valid. I'm also here to remind you that if you've clearly communicated what your boundaries are and someone continues to overstep them, it's also okay to take space or take more than just space, as in go no contact. I'm also here to remind you that anyone who makes you feel like going no contact with your in-laws was a fun or easy thing to do or an easy decision, don't even listen to them. And although it might feel like everyone thinks it's you pulling your husband away from his family, we all know that it's not. You didn't change him. He changed on his own when he saw how the person he loves more than anything in this world was being treated.
I'm married into a narcissistic family structure, and I just wanted to talk a bit about why it's so common to be shunned by your in-laws if you marry into a narcissistic family. So it's really common that narcissists like to surround themselves with people who are similar to them and people who enable and cheerlead them, whereas they typically shun or cast out people who are different from them and people who try and hold them accountable for their actions. So you're already threatening when you come into a narcissistic family because the bulk of their abuse happens behind closed doors, and they don't want you to find out about their abuse because they've tried to hide it from their kid for so long. So if you come into the family structure and you start openly stating different opinions from the narcissist and letting it be known that you're not easily manipulated and that your thoughts are your own and independent and not easily swayed, or if you start pointing out toxic behaviors of the narcissist, these are really easy ways that you can get shunned, and the narcissist is no longer going to want you to be with their child because they are afraid that you will out the abuse and their child will leave, and therefore they will lose a source of narcissistic supply.